I knew my marriage was over the moment the sheriff handed me an eviction notice with my own address printed across the top. Not because my wife had asked for a divorce. Not because she'd moved out 3 weeks earlier. But because the paperwork said I no longer owned the house I'd spent 14 years paying for. And according to the county records, I never had. If stories about betrayal, karma, and justice keep you watching until the very end, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this one unfolded. I stood on my front porch staring at the document while the sheriff waited beside his cruiser. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I just served the paperwork." I looked up at him. There has to be some mistake. He gave me one of those looks people save for bad news they've delivered too many times. "I hope there is." Then he tipped his hat, climbed back into the car, and drove away. For nearly 5 minutes, I couldn't move. The porch I'd stained myself every spring. The oak tree I'd planted with my father. The swing Emily insisted we hang after our 10th anniversary. Everything around me suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I unfolded the notice again. The property owner listed wasn't Emily. It wasn't me either. It was Margaret Dawson, Emily's mother. I whispered the name twice before it finally sank in. No, that wasn't possible. Margaret had never owned this house. She'd never paid a mortgage payment, never fixed a leaking roof, never shoveled snow, never replaced the furnace. Yet, according to the document, she'd been the legal owner for almost 4 years. For years, I felt the blood drain from my face. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 46 years old. For 22 years, I worked as a commercial electrician in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not wealthy, never was, but I believed in doing things the old-fashioned way. Work overtime, pay your bills, save for our retirement, take care of your family. My father used to say, "Money doesn't build a home, Danny. Trust does." I believed him. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. I met Emily when I was 28. She worked at a local credit union. She laughed loudly. She loved old movies. She could make conversation with anyone. Our first date lasted nearly 6 hours. When I walked her to her apartment, she smiled and said, "I don't usually stay out this late." I laughed. "I don't usually want the night to end." She kissed my cheek. "I guess we're both breaking our own rules." 2 years later, we were married. Looking back now, those first years were real. Or at least I think they were. We rented a tiny duplex with creaky floors and paper-thin walls. We couldn't afford vacations. Our furniture came from yard sales. The kitchen table leaned to one side because one leg was shorter than the others. We stuffed folded cardboard underneath it. Whenever someone bumped the table, we'd laugh. We were happy. At least, I know I was. When Emily became pregnant, we started talking about buying our own place. I worked every overtime shift available. Weekends, nights, holidays, sometimes 70 hours a week. Emily handled the paperwork. That made sense. She worked in banking. She understood loans, refinancing, insurance, everything that made my head hurt. Whenever documents needed signatures, she'd leave sticky notes. Sign here. Initial here. This one too. I never questioned it. She was my wife. Why would I? The house wasn't fancy. 3 bedrooms. An unfinished basement. Old hardwood floors. A backyard just big enough for cookouts. The previous owner had planted roses along the fence. Emily loved those flowers. Every spring she'd cut a few and place them in the kitchen. She always smiled when she did. "Home," she'd whisper. Funny how one word can mean something completely different years later. Our daughter, Sophie, was born 6 months after we moved in. She became the center of our world. Soccer games, school concerts, science fairs, late-night fevers, family movie nights. Every Christmas Eve we'd let her open exactly one present. Always pajamas. She pretended to be disappointed every year. Then she'd laugh because she'd guessed correctly. Those are the memories that make betrayal harder. If everything had been terrible, walking away would have been easy. About 8 years into our marriage, something changed. Not overnight. Slowly. Emily started keeping her phone face down. She volunteered to handle the finances completely. Whenever I asked about savings, she'd answer quickly. "We're doing fine. If I wanted to see statements, I already filed them. Taxes? I finished them. Mortgage? Auto pay? Insurance? Taken care of." She had an answer for everything. And because life stayed busy, I accepted those answers. One evening, I noticed a thick envelope from the county lying on the kitchen counter. When I reached for it, Emily picked it up almost immediately. "I'll handle it." "What is it?" "Property tax adjustment." "Anything we need to worry about?" "No." She smiled. The conversation ended. Or rather, she ended it. At the time, I thought she was being helpful. Now I remember something else. Her hands were shaking. About a year later, Margaret started visiting more often. Emily's mother and I had never been especially close. She wasn't rude, just cold. She believed Emily had settled beneath herself. I was just an electrician. She preferred doctors, lawyers, executives, people who wore expensive watches. Whenever she'd visit, she'd wander through the house making little comments. "You should remodel this kitchen. The neighborhood's declining. Property values are unpredictable." I'd usually smile politely. Emily rarely defended me. Instead, she'd change the subject. At the time, I assumed she wanted to avoid arguments. Now I wonder if there was another reason entirely. Then came the first crack that should have opened my eyes. One Saturday morning, I stopped by the hardware store for paint. The cashier recognized me. "Still fixing up your mother-in-law's place?" I frowned. "My what?" He looked confused. "The house on Maple Ridge. I live there." He chuckled awkwardly. "Oh." Then he lowered his voice. "Guess the county website's wrong then." I laughed it off. People mix things up all the time. But driving home, something didn't sit right. How would a hardware store cashier know anything about county ownership records? By the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd almost forgotten about it. Emily was planting flowers with Sophie. They looked happy. I told myself not to overthink it. Sometimes, the truth whispers long before it starts screaming. And I had no idea that one casual conversation at a hardware store was the first thread in a web that would eventually unravel my entire marriage. For the next few weeks, I couldn't shake what the cashier had said. Most people would have let it go. I tried. Life had a way of keeping me busy. At work, we were wiring a new medical office building across town. I was leaving before sunrise and getting home after dark. Sophie had started high school and needed rides to soccer practice. Emily seemed distracted, but whenever I asked if something was wrong, she'd smile without really looking at me. "I'm just tired." That became her favorite answer. Tired. Not angry, not upset, just tired. One Friday evening, I found her sitting at the dining room table with a stack of papers. The moment I walked in, she gathered them into a folder. "What's all that?" "Nothing important." "You looked busy." "Just organizing files." I reached for the folder out of habit. She pulled it toward herself. A little too quickly. Our eyes met. For just a second. Long enough. For me to notice something I'd never seen before. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. Then she forced a smile. "You've had a long day. Go relax." I nodded. But something inside me had shifted. A few days later, I logged into our online mortgage account. Or at least I tried. The password didn't work. I assumed I'd forgotten it. When I clicked "Forgot password," the recovery email wasn't mine. It wasn't even one I recognized. It belonged to Emily. That surprised me, but not enough to start a fight. When she came home, I asked casually, "Hey, did you change the mortgage login?" She didn't even hesitate. "The bank upgraded their system." "Oh, I had to create a new account. Can you send me the password?" "I will." She never did. Looking back, I realized something important. Betrayal rarely arrives like a lightning strike. It's more like a slow leak inside your walls. By the time you notice the damage, it's been happening for years. Around Thanksgiving, Emily announced something unexpected. "My mom's health isn't great. I looked up from carving the turkey. Is she okay? She's just getting older. Margaret was 68. Healthy enough to garden every day. Healthy enough to drive 3 states away to visit friends. Still, people age differently. What does she need? Emily looked at me carefully before answering. I've been helping her with some paperwork. What kind? Estate planning. I shrugged. That's nice of you. She smiled with obvious relief. Thanks for understanding. At the time, I thought the conversation was over. It wasn't. Not even close. Over the next year, Margaret became involved in almost every financial discussion. If we talked about refinancing, Emily had already discussed it with her mother. If we considered replacing the roof, Margaret had an opinion. If I suggested paying extra toward the mortgage, Emily wanted to think about it. Sometimes I'd walk into the kitchen and hear them talking. The moment they noticed me, the conversation stopped. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet, too quiet. Sophie noticed it too. One evening she knocked on the garage door while I was changing the oil in my truck. Dad? Yeah. She leaned against the workbench. Can I ask you something? Always. She hesitated. Why does Grandma always whisper with Mom? I laughed. Maybe they're talking about birthday presents. She didn't smile. I don't think so. What makes you say that? Whenever I walk in, they stop talking. Kids notice everything, especially the things adults think they're hiding. I wiped my hands on a rag. You're probably imagining it. She looked unconvinced. I don't think I am. A month later, Emily asked me to sign several documents before leaving for work. They're insurance updates. I glanced at the first page. The legal language blurred together. She tapped the signature line with her finger. We have to send these today. I signed. Then another. Then another. About halfway through, I noticed one page had been turned upside down. What's this one? She flipped it over before I could read it. Same thing. I'd rather look through it. She sighed dramatically. Daniel. What? You trust me, don't you? It wasn't what she asked. It was how she asked it. Not with warmth. With pressure. Like the answer itself was being tested. I smiled awkwardly. Of course. Then sign. I did. That moment replayed in my head thousands of times later. Not long afterward, strange mail stopped arriving altogether. Property tax notices, insurance renewals, mortgage statements, nothing. Everything became digital. According to Emily, she assured me it was more convenient, less clutter, better for the environment. I believed her. After all, she worked in banking. She understood these things. I fixed electrical systems. I trusted wires. She trusted paperwork. At least that's what I told myself. Then came the argument that changed everything. It started over something completely ordinary. A vacation. I wanted to take Sophie to Yellowstone after graduation. Emily said we couldn't afford it. Money's tight. I frowned. How? We've both been working. There are expenses you don't know about. Like what? She folded her arms. I'm handling them. I know. But maybe we should go through everything together. Her expression hardened. Are you accusing me of something? No. I'm keeping this family afloat. I didn't say you weren't. You think I don't know what I'm doing? The conversation escalated so quickly it gave me whiplash. Finally, she walked away. I stood in the kitchen wondering how talking about a family vacation had turned into an accusation. Now I know why. People guarding secrets often hear questions as threats. 6 months later, Sophie left for college. The house became painfully quiet. Emily and I were alone again for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Instead of bringing us closer, it exposed every crack we'd ignored. We stopped eating dinner together, stopped watching movies, stopped talking about our days. Sometimes we'd pass each other in the hallway like polite strangers sharing a hotel. One Saturday morning, I decided to surprise her with breakfast. I stopped at our favorite bakery, picked up cinnamon rolls, coffee, orange juice. When I walked inside, the house was empty. Her car was gone. No note. Around noon she came home. I was with Mom. For 6 hours? She looked irritated. Does it matter? I was worried. You worry too much. That sentence stayed with me. Not because of what she said. Because of what she didn't. She never apologized. A week later, I came home early after a job was canceled because of heavy rain. Emily wasn't expecting me. She was sitting at the kitchen island with Margaret. A man in a gray suit sat across from them. The moment I opened the door, all three looked up. Nobody smiled. The man closed his briefcase. I should get going. Emily stood so quickly her chair nearly tipped over. Daniel. Who's this? She answered too fast. Mom's attorney. I looked at Margaret. What are you all doing here? Just discussing her will. The attorney nodded politely. Nice meeting you. He left before I could ask another question. I watched him drive away, then turned back toward Emily. Why are you discussing your mother's will in our kitchen? Emily crossed her arms. Because it's convenient. Without telling me? It doesn't involve you. That answer hit harder than I expected. Not because it was rude. Because it felt rehearsed. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I got up for water. As I walked past the home office, I noticed light under the door. Emily was inside. She didn't hear me. She was feeding papers into our shredder. Page after page. The machine hummed steadily through the silence. I stood there for several seconds before she noticed my shadow. She jumped. What are you doing? I looked at the overflowing bin. What are you doing? Cleaning out old files. At 2 in the morning? She stared at me, then smiled. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I. Because for the first time in 20 years, I realized I wasn't living with the woman I thought I'd married. I was living with someone who seemed determined to make sure I never saw certain pieces of paper. And I was beginning to wonder exactly what those papers had said. For the next several days, I couldn't stop thinking about that shredder. I wasn't looking for an affair anymore. I wasn't even looking for a divorce. I was looking for an answer. Why was my wife destroying documents in the middle of the night? And why did every question about our finances seem to upset her? The following Monday, I took a vacation day without telling anyone. Not because I wanted to spy on Emily, because I wanted to understand my own life. After she left for work, I drove to the county recorder's office. It was an old brick building downtown, the kind with polished floors and faded photographs of former county officials lining the hallway. A woman behind the records counter smiled. How can I help you today? I'd like to pull the property records for my home. She asked for the address, typed for a few seconds, then turned the monitor slightly so she could confirm the parcel number. I wasn't supposed to see the screen, but I saw enough. Owner, Margaret Dawson. Date of transfer, 3 years and 11 months earlier. I felt my stomach tighten. There must be a mistake. She frowned politely. We can print the recorded documents if you'd like. Please. 5M. Minutes later, she handed me a thick packet. At the top was a recorded warranty deed. Grantor, Daniel Carter. Grantee, Margaret Dawson. Purchase price, $10. $10. I stared at my own signature, or what looked like my signature. It certainly resembled it, but something felt wrong. The shape of the letters wasn't quite right. The spacing looked off. The D in Daniel leaned farther than mine usually did. It was close. Close enough to fool most people. Not close enough to fool the man who had signed his name thousands of times over 20 years. I looked back at the clerk. Can I get certified copies? Of course. I paid the fee and walked back to my truck. I sat there for almost 20 minutes without turning the key. Someone had transferred my house. Someone had signed my name. And somehow, no one had questioned it. Instead of going home, I drove to work. Not because I needed to, because I needed someone I trusted. My foreman, Mike Reynolds, had worked beside me for almost 18 years. He wasn't the kind of man who gave dramatic advice. He listened first, then spoke. When I laid the papers on his desk, he read every page in silence. Finally, he looked up. You sign this? No. You sure? I'd bet my life on it. He nodded once. Then don't confront anybody. What? Not yet. I want answers. I know. He slid the papers back toward me. But if somebody forged a deed... He paused. They've probably covered their tracks everywhere else too. That sentence changed my approach completely. For the first time, I stopped thinking like an angry husband. I started thinking like someone gathering evidence. That evening, I acted like nothing had happened. Emily made spaghetti. We watched television. She talked about a new manager at work. I nodded at all the right moments. Inside, my mind was racing. At one point she smiled at me across the table. It looked completely normal, natural, comfortable. If I hadn't been holding those certified records in my truck, I would have believed everything was fine. That's what frightened me the most. She could lie without looking like she was lying. The next morning I called an attorney. Not a divorce lawyer. A real estate attorney. His name was Thomas Green. He'd practiced property law for more than 30 years. After reviewing the documents, he leaned back in his chair. Mr. Carter. Yes. Who handled the closing when you bought the house? My wife mostly. And who handled your refinancing? My wife. He nodded slowly. Do you have copies? No. He folded his hands. I think that's where we begin. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas submitted requests for every document connected to the property. The purchase, the mortgage, the refinancing, the transfer, every signature, every notarization, every filing. He also hired a forensic document examiner, someone who specialized in handwriting analysis. I didn't even know jobs like that existed. Meanwhile, life at home became stranger. Emily started asking unusual questions. What time will you be home? Did anything interesting happen today? You seem distracted. She was studying me, trying to decide if I knew something. I answered exactly the same way every time. Just tired. The same excuse she'd used for years. One Friday afternoon, Thomas called. Can you come by? His voice sounded different. Serious. When I arrived, 3 folders sat on the conference table. He opened the first one. Your original purchase documents. Everything looked normal. Then he opened the second. The refinancing package. Again, mostly normal. Then came the third folder. This, he slid a notarized document toward me, is where everything changes. I looked down. Power of attorney. Supposedly signed by me, giving Emily authority to execute real estate transactions on my behalf. My signature appeared at the bottom. So did a notary stamp. Thomas watched my face. You've never seen this before. No, I didn't think so. He slid another page beside it. The notary's commission had expired 8 months before the document was supposedly signed. Someone had used an invalid notary seal, a detail almost no ordinary person would ever notice. But it was enough to call the entire document into question. I felt my hands shaking. So, Thomas nodded. If this power of attorney is fraudulent, he tapped the warranty deed, then everything that happened afterward may also be invalid. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt sick, because this wasn't one bad decision. It wasn't one lie. It was a carefully constructed plan, one that had taken years. Before I left, Thomas gave me one piece of advice. Whatever you do. I looked at him. Don't accuse anyone yet. Why not? Because if they think we've discovered this. He closed the folders. We may never learn how deep it goes. That weekend, Emily suggested something completely unexpected. We should have dinner with Mom tomorrow. I forced a smile. Sounds good. She looked relieved, almost as if she needed me to act normal for one more day. I had no idea why, but I intended to find out. The next evening, Margaret welcomed us into her house with unusual warmth. Too much warmth. She hugged me, asked about work, poured me a glass of wine. She'd never done any of those things before. Halfway through dinner, she excused herself to answer a phone call. Emily followed her into the kitchen. They thought I couldn't hear them, but the hallway carried every whisper. Margaret spoke first. Has he said anything? No. Are you sure? I would have known. There was a long pause. Then Margaret whispered something that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. Good. Once the sale goes through, it won't matter anymore. I froze. Sale? What sale? I hadn't seen the house listed anywhere. No sign in the yard. No real estate agent. Nothing. I quietly pulled out my phone, opened the voice recorder, and hit record just as their conversation continued. I still didn't know who they were planning to sell my house to, but for the first time, I had proof that whatever they were hiding, it wasn't over yet. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was angry. Anger comes and goes. This was different. I was trying to understand how the woman I'd shared a bed with for nearly 20 years could sit across from me at dinner, ask if I wanted more mashed potatoes, and then step into another room to discuss selling the roof over my head. The recording on my phone wasn't perfect. Plates clinked. A faucet ran in the background. But the words were clear enough. Once the sale goes through, it won't matter anymore. I played that sentence over and over until dawn. The first thing Monday morning, I emailed the audio file to Thomas. He called less than an hour later. Don't let them know you recorded anything. I won't. And Daniel. His voice became more serious. If they're preparing to sell the property, we need to move quickly. What do we do? I'm filing a notice to dispute the title. I don't understand. It won't decide ownership. He paused. But it can make buyers and title companies aware that the ownership is being challenged. In other words, it makes it much harder for someone to quietly sell the house. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone had finally put a brick under a collapsing wall. That afternoon, Thomas introduced me to another attorney in his firm. Her name was Rachel Kim. She specialized in financial fraud. She spent nearly 2 hours asking questions I never would have thought to ask. Who paid the utility bills? Emily did. Who received the tax notices? Emily. Who handled homeowners insurance? Emily. Did you ever review your joint bank statements? I hesitated. Not really. She nodded without judgment. Did she encourage that? I guess. Then I corrected myself. No. She insisted. Rachel wrote something in her notebook. When one person controls every financial document in a marriage, it's often about convenience. She looked up. But sometimes, it's about control. That sentence followed me home. Control. Not money. Not greed. Control. Looking back, I began remembering little things I'd dismissed for years. Emily insisted on checking the mail first. She preferred paperless billing. She discouraged me from opening financial emails because, as she'd often say, you'll just get so an F. Used by all the banking language. At the time, I'd laughed. Now it sounded less like help and more like isolation. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. Sophie came home from college. She'd called earlier to say she wanted to spend the weekend with us. Emily seemed unusually nervous. I forgot she was coming. You've known for a week. I've just had a lot on my mind. When Sophie walked through the front door, she hugged me so tightly I almost lost my balance. You look tired, Dad. I've been working. She stepped back and studied my face. No. She lowered her voice. Something's wrong. Before I could answer, Emily walked into the hallway. Who's hungry? The conversation ended before it began. That evening, Sophie helped me wash dishes. Emily had gone upstairs to take a shower. The water started running. Sophie waited another few seconds before speaking. Dad. Yeah. I need to tell you something. She looked toward the staircase. I didn't know if it mattered. My heart started beating faster. What is it? She took a deep breath. About 6 months ago. I came home during fall break. I nodded. You were working overtime. Emily had mentioned that visit. I remember. I needed my birth certificate for a campus job. So, Mom told me it was locked in her filing cabinet. She swallowed. When I opened the drawer, she looked at me carefully. I saw a folder with our address on it. I stayed quiet. There was a sticky note. What did it say? Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Don't let Daniel see these. The plate slipped from my hands into the sink. Thankfully, it didn't break. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. You actually read that? She nodded. I thought it was strange. Did you look inside? I started to. But Mom walked into the room. What happened? She slammed the drawer shut. Sophie forced a weak smile. She actually apologized afterward. For what? For being protective of important paperwork. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the backyard. The porch light cast long shadows across the grass. I kept thinking about Sophie's face. She wasn't angry. She looked guilty, as though she'd somehow failed me by not mentioning it sooner. None of this was her fault. She'd been a kid trying to trust her parents, just like I'd spent 20 years trusting my wife. The following week, Rachel called. We've received the banking records. Anything useful? A lot. She didn't elaborate over the phone. Can you come in? An hour later, I was sitting across from her conference table again. She spread out dozens of statements. Colored tabs marked different pages. I want you to look at these transfers. I leaned closer. Every few months, large sums had been transferred from our joint savings account. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000, always to the same account. Account holder, Margaret Dawson. I blinked. I never approved these. Rachel nodded. I didn't think you had. How much? She turned the last page toward me. I stared at the total. $184,600. I felt physically sick. That's our emergency savings, our retirement, our daughter's college fund. Rachel looked at me sympathetically. Most of these transfers were labeled as family trust contributions. I don't even have a family trust. I know. I leaned back in my chair. For years, I'd believed overtime was slowly building our future. Instead, piece by piece, it had been disappearing into Margaret's account. What happens now? I asked. Rachel answered carefully. Now we determine whether Margaret knew where the money came from. And if she did, then this becomes much bigger than a property dispute. As I left the office, my phone buzzed. It was Emily. Emily, can you come home early? We need to talk. I stared at the message. After weeks of avoiding difficult conversations, she suddenly wanted one. I replied with a single word. Sure. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, Emily wasn't alone. Margaret's car was already there. Both of them were sitting on my front porch, waiting. Emily stood as I got out of the truck. She looked pale. Margaret wouldn't meet my eyes. Emily took one hesitant step toward me. Daniel, we need to tell you something. For the first time in weeks, it sounded like the truth might finally be coming. But I had a feeling it wasn't the whole truth. Emily stood on the porch with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Margaret remained seated. She looked anywhere but at me. The silence stretched long enough that I finally broke it. You said you needed to tell me something. Emily nodded. Can we go inside? I looked at both of them. No. Her eyes widened. Daniel, if this conversation is important enough for both of you to be here. I folded my arms. It can happen right here. A neighbor walked his dog across the street. Emily glanced toward him, obviously uncomfortable. Please. I shook my head. No more private conversations. For the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. Margaret cleared her throat. Daniel, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. A misunderstanding? Emily quickly stepped in. Mom, let me explain. She turned toward me. The house. She stopped, took a breath. The paperwork was supposed to protect us. I stared at her. Protect us from what? She hesitated, then looked at her mother. Neither answered. Let me guess, I said quietly. This has something to do with the paperwork you've been hiding for 4 years. Emily's face lost its color. Who told you that? So there is hidden paperwork. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Margaret stood up abruptly. We're leaving. Emily grabbed her mother's arm. No. For the first time since they'd arrived, the two of them weren't working together. They looked like two people suddenly realizing their stories might not match. Emily swallowed. I made some decisions. I've noticed. They weren't meant to hurt you. I looked directly into her eyes. Then why didn't you tell me? She opened her mouth, closed it again. Finally, she whispered, because I knew you'd never agree. Those words hit harder than any shouting could have. Not because she admitted making decisions without me. Because she'd admitted she already knew they were wrong. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the certified copy of the deed. Without saying a word, I handed it to her. She looked down. The moment she recognized it, every bit of color disappeared from her face. Where did you get this? The county recorder's office. Her hands started trembling. Margaret leaned over to look. The instant she saw the document, she whispered, "Oh God. Not this isn't true. Not it's fake. Just, oh God." Emily looked up. I can explain. I've been waiting years for that. She looked like she was trying to organize 1,000 thoughts at once. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. What exactly wasn't? The transfer. So there was a transfer. She stopped herself too late. I noticed Margaret closing her eyes, almost as if she knew the conversation had already gone too far. Before anyone spoke again, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I answered. Daniel. His voice was calm. I just received something. What? A title company contacted our office. I frowned. What about? They were preparing closing documents on your property. I slowly looked at Emily. When? They requested preliminary title work this morning. This morning, while Emily had been texting me to come home early. She already knew. Someone was trying to buy the house. Thomas continued. Our notice stopped the transaction. I closed my eyes for a moment. If we hadn't filed yesterday, they probably would have completed the sale. I thanked him and ended the call. When I looked back at Emily, she already knew exactly what the call had been about. They tried to sell it. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Emily didn't answer. They actually tried to sell our home. Still nothing. Finally, Margaret spoke. It wasn't like that. I looked at her. Then tell me exactly what it was like. She hesitated. It was only supposed to be temporary. What was? The transfer. Temporary for 4 years? She couldn't answer. I took a slow breath. I've also seen the bank records. Emily's head snapped toward me. What bank records? The transfers. Neat. Her woman moved. $184,600. Margaret instinctively stepped backward. Emily looked as though she might faint. You've been sending our money to your mother's account. Emily whispered. It wasn't stealing. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. It wasn't. No. Then what was it? It was protecting it. Protecting it from who? She wiped away a tear. You. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. Me? You work construction. I'm an electrician. You could have been sued. I blinked. What? You could have been injured. I carry insurance. You never know. Her explanations came faster now. If something happened. If creditors came after us. If there was an accident. My mother said the safest thing was to move assets. I stared at Margaret. She finally spoke. I was trying to protect my daughter. Couldn't help it. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because it was unbelievable. You forged documents. Transferred our home. Moved nearly $200,000. And you're calling it protection? Emily started crying. I never wanted this. I asked the only question that mattered. Then why didn't you stop? She looked at her mother. Then back at me. I couldn't. That answer didn't make sense. Couldn't? Or wouldn't? There was a difference. And I intended to find out. The next morning, Rachel called before I'd even left for work. We found something else. I drove straight to her office. She had another stack of documents waiting. This account. She pointed to Margaret's bank statements. Didn't just receive money. It sent money. To who? Rachel turned another page. Several cashier's checks. Large amounts. Always made payable to the same law firm. What law firm is that? Rachel looked at me carefully. A family estate planning firm. I frowned. What does that have to do with anything? She slid one final document across the table. It was an invoice. Client name, Emily Dawson Carter. Service description, creation of the Dawson Family Asset Protection Trust. Trust, the same word that had appeared in the fake transfer descriptions. But there was something even more disturbing. The trust had been created 2 months before Emily asked me to refinance the house, meaning this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been planned, methodically, long before I ever signed another document. Rachel folded her hands. I think we've answered one question. Which one? This wasn't panic. She looked directly at me. It was a long-term strategy. I nodded slowly. And now I have another question. What is it? I picked up the invoice. If they created a trust. I looked at Rachel. Who convinced them this was legal? Rachel was silent for a moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. I don't think your wife invented this plan. You think someone else did? She nodded. I think someone advised them. The room suddenly felt smaller. Because if she was right, Emily and Margaret weren't the only people involved. Someone with legal knowledge had helped build this entire scheme. And that meant the biggest secret in my marriage still hadn't been uncovered. I left Rachel's office with one thought circling in my head. This had never been just about my marriage. Someone had designed this. Not just the paperwork, the timing, the transfers, the trust, the refinancing. Every piece fit together too neatly to be an accident. And if someone had helped build the plan, I wanted to know whether they'd been misled or whether they'd knowingly crossed a line. That evening, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to Sophie's apartment near campus. She opened the door with a worried look. Dad, you busy? She stepped aside immediately. Never too busy for you. Her apartment was small. Second-hand furniture. Tiny kitchen. A stack of textbooks on the coffee table. It reminded me of the little duplex where Emily and I had started our life together. For a moment, I wondered how two people could begin with so little and still lose everything that mattered. Sophie made coffee. Neither of us spoke until we were sitting at the kitchen table. Finally, she looked at me. How bad is it? I considered lying. Instead, I told her the truth. Much worse than I imagined. She stared into her mug. Are you getting divorced? I don't know. You've never lied to me before. I managed a tired smile. I'm trying not to start now. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I don't want you to stay because of me. Those words caught me off guard. What do you mean? I've been an adult for a while now. She swallowed. If Mom has done something terrible, don't spend the rest of your life pretending she didn't. On the drive home, I realized something. For months, I'd been making decisions based on protecting everyone else. Maybe it was finally time to protect myself. The next morning, Thomas called. I've received the preliminary response from Margaret's attorney. What does it say? They insist everything was done with your knowledge and consent. I almost laughed. Based on forged documents? They don't admit the documents are forged. So what's their argument? Thomas sighed. They're claiming you verbally agreed to transfer the property into Margaret's name as part of long-term estate planning. That's ridiculous. I know. He paused. But now they're committed to that story. 2 days later, we filed a civil action asking the court to declare the deed invalid. Thomas explained every step carefully. We're not asking for money first. We're asking the court to determine who actually owns the property. And after that, if the court agrees the transfer was fraudulent, he closed the file. The financial CLA, IMS become much stronger. Everything was happening legally, patiently, exactly the way I'd promised myself it would. Still, it was exhausting. Emily moved into Margaret's house the following weekend. She didn't leave dramatically. No shouting. No slammed doors. She packed quietly. 3 suitcases. A few boxes. Before she left, she stood in the living room looking around. This wasn't how I thought our marriage would end. I looked at her. It doesn't have to. She blinked. What? It could have ended with honesty. She lowered her eyes. I know. You still haven't told me everything. I can't. Or you won't. She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the last box and walked out. I noticed she left our wedding photo on the fireplace, face down. 3 weeks later, both sides met for mediation. The mediator, a retired judge, began with the usual introductions. Then he asked a simple question. Is there any possibility of resolving this without trial? Thomas looked at me. I nodded. I'll settle today. Across the table, Emily looked hopeful for the first time. Then I continued. I want the deed cancelled, the money returned, and a complete accounting of every transfer made from our accounts. The room became very quiet. Margaret's attorney leaned over to whisper something to her. She shook her head. No. The mediation lasted nearly 7 hours. It ended without an agreement. As we were leaving, Emily quietly caught up to me in the hallway. Daniel. I stopped. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I stared at her for several seconds. You still think I'm the one making this hard? A tear rolled down her cheek. I made mistakes. Mistakes happen once. I shook my head. This happened for 4 years. She had no answer. A month later, Rachel called with another breakthrough. You need to see this. When I arrived, she handed me a deposition transcript from an unrelated probate case. What am I looking for? Page 23. I found the highlighted section. One name jumped out immediately. Harold Benton, the attorney who had prepared the Dawson Family Asset Protection Trust. Rachel spoke quietly. He testified under oath that he prepares documents based entirely on information provided by clients. So, he also testified that he never met you. I looked up. What? He prepared paperwork affecting your marital assets without ever speaking to you. That didn't automatically mean he'd done anything wrong. But it meant something important. He'd relied completely on Emily and Margaret's version of events. If they had misrepresented the facts, the responsibility didn't necessarily end with them. Later that afternoon, Thomas received another envelope. This one wasn't from an attorney. It was from the title company. Inside was a copy of an email. The original buyer had withdrawn from the purchase. Reason: unresolved ownership dispute, TE and potential fraud. For the first time since this nightmare began, the sale was officially dead. They couldn't sell the house. Not anymore. That evening, I drove past the place Emily was staying. Not because I intended to confront her. I just wanted to understand something. Margaret's house was dark except for one upstairs window. As I sat across the street, another car pulled into the driveway. A silver SUV. A man in a business suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He wasn't Harold Benton. I knew that much, but I had seen him before. Took me a moment to remember where. Then it hit me. He was the same man I'd found sitting in my kitchen months earlier. The one Emily had introduced as Mom's attorney. Except now, he wasn't visiting Margaret to discuss a will. He was carrying boxes of files out of the house and loading them into his SUV. I watched him glance over both shoulders before closing the trunk. It looked less like a routine visit, and more like someone trying to remove evidence before anyone else could ask for it. I didn't follow him. 6 months earlier, I probably would have. I would have let anger make decisions for me. Not anymore. Instead, I took out my phone, noted the license plate, the time, and the direction he drove before heading home. The next morning, I emailed everything to Thomas. His reply came 10 minutes later. Good. Don't contact him. Let us handle it. That sentence probably saved my case. 2 days later, Thomas called. We identified the man. Who is he? His name is Richard Holloway. The attorney? No. He isn't licensed to practice law. I frowned. Then why was he carrying legal files? Thomas sighed. He's a certified financial planner. That surprised me. So why did Emily introduce him as an attorney? I don't know. But we're going to find out. During discovery, both sides were required to exchange documents. Thousands of pages changed hands. Bank records, emails, closing documents, tax filings, phone logs. Rachel and Thomas spent days reviewing everything. Most of it was ordinary, until Rachel found one email. She called me immediately. Daniel, I think we found the first crack. I was in her office less than an hour later. She turned her monitor toward me. An email from 4 years earlier filled the screen. From Richard Holloway to Emily Carter. Subject: Asset Protection Timeline. Rachel pointed to one sentence. Daniel must not become aware of the ownership transfer until every related document has been recorded. I read it again, then a third time. He actually wrote that? Rachel nodded. It's his email. I felt my chest tighten. They planned to hide it from me. That's what this suggests. And Margaret was copied? Rachel clicked another line. Yes, Margaret had received the same email. Thomas immediately requested Richard Holloway's deposition. His attorney tried to delay it, then tried to limit the questions. The judge denied both requests. For the first time, I felt like the truth wasn't just approaching. It was forcing its way into the room. The deposition took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. I wasn't required to attend, but Thomas thought I should. Richard Holloway looked nothing like the confident man I'd seen leaving Margaret's house. He looked exhausted. His tie was crooked. Dark circles sat under his eyes. After swearing him in, Thomas began calmly. Mr. Holloway, who first contacted you regarding the Carter property? Emily Carter. Did she tell you the property belonged solely to her? Yes. Did she tell you it was marital property purchased during the marriage? A long pause. No. Thomas nodded. So your advice was based on incomplete information? Yes. Rachel handed him another document. Is this your email? Yes. Why did you write that Daniel must not become aware of the transfer? Richard rubbed his forehead. Because Emily said she wanted to surprise him later. The room became silent. Thomas didn't react. He simply asked, a surprise? Richard looked embarrassed. That's what she told me. What kind of surprise? He hesitated. I never asked. Then Rachel placed another document in front of him. A handwritten note from one of his meetings. His own handwriting. It read, client concerned husband would refuse to sign if informed. Rachel looked directly at him. So at some point, you understood Mr. Carter would not agree. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Yes. Yet you continued helping prepare financial plans based on that assumption? I relied on counsel for the legal documents. So you knew there was a problem. His attorney objected. The objection was noted. But the answer had already been given. After 4 hours, the deposition ended. Outside the building, Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. He helped us. It didn't sound like it. He admitted he never verified ownership. He admitted he knew you weren't involved. And most importantly, Thomas held up the email. He admitted secrecy was part of the plan. That afternoon, something happened I never expected. Emily called me. Not my attorney. Me. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. She was crying. Real crying. Not the controlled tears I'd seen during mediation. I need to talk to you. You've had months. I know. It's too late. No. Her voice cracked. It isn't. There was a long silence. Finally, she whispered, I didn't think it would go this far. I closed my eyes. Then how far did you think it would go? I thought. She stopped. I thought eventually I'd tell you. When? I don't know. After selling the house? Silence. After moving our savings? Silence. After forging my signature? More silence. Then she whispered the words I'd been waiting to hear. I never forged your signature. I opened my eyes. What? I signed some papers. But not those. For the first time in this entire nightmare, Emily had separated herself from one specific act. Not all of it, just one. Who forged it? She started crying harder. I can't say. Why? Because it'll destroy my mother. Before I could respond, she ended the call. I immediately called Thomas. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said quietly, "That's interesting." "What is?" "She didn't deny the forgery. She denied doing it. I hadn't thought about it that way." Meaning she's pointing at someone else. 3 days later, we received notice that the judge had ruled on our motion. The court found sufficient evidence to keep the title dispute in place until trial. No refinancing. No transfer. No sale. The property was effectively frozen. When Thomas called with the news, I walked out onto the back porch. For the first time in months, I felt like the house beneath my feet wasn't slipping away. That evening, Sophie came over for dinner. We ordered pizza. Neither of us felt like cooking. Halfway through the meal, she reached into her backpack. I almost forgot. She handed me a small, worn notebook. "I found this while packing some old boxes from the attic." I frowned. "What is it?" "It was in Mom's desk." I opened it. Most of the pages contained grocery lists, birthday reminders, phone numbers. Then, near the middle, one folded sheet fell into my lap. It wasn't handwritten. It was a checklist, typed. Each item had a date beside it. Establish trust. Refinance property. Record deed. Transfer savings. Prepare sale. My heart pounded. One final item remained unchecked. Finalize after Daniel signs divorce agreement. I looked up at Sophie. She stared back at me in disbelief. Neither of us spoke, because we had just discovered something that changed everything. The plan had never been to tell me the truth. The plan had been to keep me in the dark, until I unknowingly signed away whatever rights I still had. I must have read that checklist a dozen times before the words finally stopped blurring. Finalize after Daniel signs divorce agreement. It wasn't a reminder scribbled on the back of an envelope. It wasn't a rough idea. It was a plan. A step-by-step plan. And every box except the last one had already been checked. I looked at Sophie. "Are you sure this came from your mother's desk?" She nodded slowly. "I found it inside one of her old planners. I almost threw it away." I carefully slid the paper back into the notebook. "No." I took a deep breath. "This may be the most important thing we've found." The next morning, Thomas and Rachel examined the checklist. Rachel didn't say anything for nearly a minute. "Fina." LOY, she looked up. "If this is authentic, it supports a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" I asked. "A deliberate sequence." She pointed to each line. "The trust. The refinance. The deed. The money transfers. The planned sale." She tapped the final unchecked box. "And they expected you to sign a divorce agreement before discovering any of it." Thomas nodded. "This isn't proof by itself, but combined with everything else." He closed the notebook. "It tells a very convincing story." A week later, the judge scheduled the case for trial. There would be no jury. The facts were too document-heavy. A judge would decide. Thomas preferred it that way. Judges read paperwork. They notice inconsistencies. They care about timelines. For the first time since this began, I stopped imagining dramatic courtroom speeches. This wasn't television. It was binders, evidence, dates, bank records, emails, signatures. The truth wasn't going to win because it was emotional. It was going to win because it was documented. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No packed gallery. No reporters. Just the judge, the attorneys, a court reporter, and a handful of people whose lives had somehow become connected to mine. Emily sat at one table beside her attorney. Margaret sat next to her. Neither of them looked in my direction. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The hearing began quietly. Thomas called me as the first witness. He started with simple questions. My occupation, how long I'd been married, when we'd purchased the house, Who made the mortgage payments? Then he placed the original deed in front of me. Mr. Carter, did you ever knowingly transfer your home to Margaret Dawson? No. Did you authorize anyone else to do so? No. Did you ever intend to give away your ownership? Never. There was no drama. Just answers. Clear. Direct. True. Then came the cross-examination. Emily's attorney stood. Mr. Carter, would you describe yourself as someone who paid close attention to financial paperwork? No. You trusted your wife? Yes. So it's possible you signed documents without reading every page? Yes. He nodded. So it's possible you signed this deed. Thomas immediately objected. The judge sustained the objection. The attorney changed direction. You signed many documents over the years, correct? I did. And you relied on your wife to explain them? Yes. I looked directly at him. I trusted my wife. The courtroom fell quiet. Trust. That had always been the center of this story. Not paperwork. Trust. Rachel then called the forensic handwriting examiner. She explained the differences between my verified signatures and the one on the deed. Stroke pressure, letter spacing, pen lifts, natural writing rhythm. The judge asked several questions. By the end of her testimony, one thing was obvious. The signature on the deed hadn't been written by me. Then Richard Holloway testified. He looked even more nervous than he had during his deposition. This time, under oath in open court, he admitted something he hadn't admitted before. I assumed Mrs. Carter had discussed everything with her husband. Rachel asked quietly, "When did you realize that assumption might be wrong?" Richard swallowed. When she asked that certain documents be sent only to her mother's address. The courtroom became very still. Rachel continued, "And did that concern you?" "Yes." "What did you do?" "I asked if Mr. Carter knew." "What did she say?" Richard lowered his eyes. "She said, he doesn't need to know until everything is finished." Emily closed her eyes. Margaret stared at the table. Then came the testimony no one expected. Margaret asked to speak. Her own attorney looked surprised. After a brief discussion, the judge allowed it. Margaret walked slowly to the witness stand. She looked much older than she had just a few months earlier. Her voice trembled. "I want to correct something." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Margaret looked toward me for the first time since the trial began. "Daniel, I'm sorry." Then she turned back to the judge. "My daughter did not create this plan." The courtroom froze. Emily looked up sharply. "Mom." Margaret continued anyway. "I did." Emily whispered, "Please stop." But Margaret kept talking. "I convinced her. I told her men in construction were sued all the time. I told her assets should be protected. I told her moving everything into my name was temporary." She wiped away tears. "I kept saying we'd put it back later." Rachel stood. "Mrs. Dawson, did Mr. Carter ever know about this?" "No." "Did he ever agree?" "No." "And the forged signature?" Margaret broke down completely. "I hired someone to prepare it." The room went silent. Emily buried her face in her hands. I couldn't move. For months I'd wondered who had forged my name. Now I had my answer. It hadn't been my wife. It had been her mother. The judge called a short recess. I walked into the hallway and sat alone on a wooden bench. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt exhausted. Nothing Margaret admitted could give me back the years I'd spent believing my marriage was built on honesty. Nothing could erase the nights I'd worked overtime believing I was building a future for my family. The truth had finally arrived, but it came carrying a price. When court resumed, Emily asked if she could briefly address the judge. She wasn't under oath anymore. She simply wanted to speak. Permission was granted. She stood slowly. "I should have stopped this." Her voice barely carried across the courtroom. "I told myself I was protecting our future." She looked toward me. But somewhere along the way, I stopped protecting my marriage. There was nothing theatrical about her words. No attempt to excuse herself. No effort to blame anyone else. Just regret. Real regret. The judge listened without interrupting, then announced that he would review the evidence and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. The trial was over. Now, all that remained was the judgment. Those 2 weeks felt longer than the previous 4 months combined. There were no more depositions, no more surprise documents, no more whispered conversations in courthouse hallways. Just waiting. People think justice is dramatic. Most of the time, it's painfully quiet. I went back to work. Not because I could focus, because I needed routine. Electricity made sense. A wire either carried power or it didn't. A breaker either tripped or it didn't. There were rules, predictable outcomes. My personal life had become the exact opposite. Every evening, I'd pull into the driveway and sit in my truck for a minute before going inside. The house felt different now. Not because Emily was gone, because every room reminded me of a decision I'd made based on trust. The kitchen where I'd signed documents without reading them. The living room where we'd planned Sophie's future. The dining table where we'd celebrated birthdays while thousands of dollars quietly disappeared from our savings. The memories hadn't changed, but my understanding of them had. Sophie came over every Sunday. Sometimes we'd cook. Sometimes we'd order takeout. Sometimes we'd just sit on the back porch. One afternoon she looked at me and asked, "Do you hate Mom?" The question caught me off guard. I took my time answering. "No." She looked surprised. "I don't. I hate what happened. I hate the choices she made. But hate is a heavy thing to carry." She nodded slowly. "I still love her. You don't have to choose between your parents." A tear rolled down her cheek. I felt like I did. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "That's one burden you are never going to carry." 3 days before the judge's decision, Emily asked to meet. This time it wasn't at Margaret's house. She suggested a small coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. I almost declined. Then I remembered something Thomas had said. You don't have to reconcile to listen. So I went. She was already there when I arrived. No makeup, hair pulled back, a cup of coffee she'd barely touched. She looked tired. Not the way she'd used that word for years. Truly tired. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't." She nodded. "I wouldn't have blamed you." For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she reached into her purse and placed a small envelope on the table. "What's this?" "I found it after I moved into Mom's house." I opened it carefully. Inside was a single key. I frowned. "What does T.S. open?" "A safe deposit box." "You knew about it?" She nodded. "I knew it existed, but I'd never seen what was inside. Until after the trial." She looked down. "I opened it because I finally stopped believing everything my mother told me." "What was inside?" "Documents." "What kind?" She swallowed. "The original trust paperwork. And there was also a handwritten letter." "From who?" "My father." That surprised me. Emily's father had died almost 15 years earlier. She pushed the envelope closer. "He wrote it before he passed away." "What did it say?" Tears filled her eyes. "He warned my mother." "About what?" "He told her." She struggled to finish the sentence. "That controlling people isn't the same as protecting them." I stared at her. "He wrote that." She nodded. "He said if she didn't learn the difference, she'd eventually lose everyone she loved." Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Emily looked at me. I should have listened to him. I didn't know what to say. Some apologies come too late. Not because they aren't sincere, because the damage has already been done. The next morning, I gave the key to Thomas. He obtained a court order allowing the contents of the safe deposit box to be reviewed. There was nothing shocking inside. No hidden millions. No secret property. Just the original planning documents. Meeting notes. Letters. And one notebook. Margaret had kept detailed notes for years. One entry caught everyone's attention. It was dated nearly 4 years earlier. "Emily is worried Daniel will never agree. I told her he doesn't need to agree if he never knows." Thomas closed the notebook. I think that's the final piece. 2 days later, the judge issued his ruling. Thomas called me before I'd even left for work. Can you come to my office? Is it good? He smiled through the phone. Just come. When I arrived, Rachel was already there. Neither of them spoke immediately. Thomas handed me a copy of the judgment. I read the first page, then the second. Finally, I reached the conclusion. The court found that the deed transferring my home had been obtained through fraud and was declared void. Legal ownership immediately returned to me. The court also ordered that every dollar improperly transferred from our joint accounts be fully accounted for. Funds that could be traced were to be returned. Assets purchased with those funds were subject to recovery. The judge's opinion included one sentence I never forgot. Trust within a marriage cannot be used as a substitute for informed legal consent. I read it twice, then a third time. For months, I'd wondered if anyone would truly understand what had happened. The judge did. There was one final surprise. Margaret's attorney quietly informed the court that she had agreed to settle the remaining financial claims. She didn't appeal. She didn't argue. She sold a lake cabin she'd inherited years earlier and several investment accounts to repay the money. Not because she wanted to, because the evidence left her with little choice. When the final accounting was complete, almost all of our savings had been recovered. Not every dollar, but enough to rebuild. A week later, I met Emily one last time. Not to discuss the lawsuit, not to discuss the house, to sign the divorce papers. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The checklist I'd found had expected me to unknowingly sign away my rights. Instead, I signed documents that finally told the truth. She slid the papers toward me. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I looked at her. I know. I'm only asking you to believe. She paused. That I finally understand what I destroyed. I signed my name, my real signature, the one no one would ever forge again. As I stood to leave, she quietly said, I hope someday you find peace. I stopped at the door. I hope someday you do too. Then I walked away. The chapter that had defined half my life was finally over. People often ask me what happened after the court case. They expect a dramatic ending, a celebration, some grand moment where everything suddenly felt right again. Real life doesn't work that way. Justice can restore property, can recover money, can correct legal records, but it can't rewind time, can't erase memories, and it certainly can't rebuild trust overnight. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I walked through my house with a fresh can of paint. The living room walls still carried the same color Emily had chosen years earlier. Soft gray. She'd called it morning mist. Every time I looked at it, I heard her voice. So I changed it. Not because there was anything wrong with the color. Because I needed the house to become mine again. One wall at a time. One room at a time. Sophie came over that weekend to help. By the end of the day, there was more paint on our clothes than on the walls. She laughed as she looked at a streak of white across my forehead. You missed a spot. I thought I was the electrician. You are. But apparently you're not much of a painter. For the first time in over a year, the laughter inside that house sounded genuine. Not forced. Not polite. Real. As the months passed, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I kept working. I paid off the remaining legal bills. I reopened the savings account, this time in my name alone. Not because I had stopped believing in marriage. Because I had finally learned that trust and responsibility should never be separated. Every financial decision became something I understood, not something I simply signed. That lesson had been expensive, but I wasn't going to waste it. Emily moved into a small townhouse on the other side of Columbus. She found a new job at a Regio, an AL bank. From what Sophie told me, she kept mostly to herself. She also started volunteering at a nonprofit that helped older adults understand financial scams and document fraud. When Sophie mentioned it, I was surprised. Really? She nodded. Mom says if she can't undo what she did, maybe she can stop it from happening to someone else. I didn't know whether that erased anything. Didn't. But it told me she was trying to become someone different. Sometimes that's all a person can do. Margaret's story ended very differently. The civil judgment forced her to liquidate much of what she'd spent years accumulating. The lake cabin she'd loved was sold. Several investment accounts were closed. She quietly withdrew from the social circles where she'd once enjoyed talking about financial success. No criminal charges were filed because the case had been resolved through the civil courts and the parties involved reached a comprehensive settlement. But the legal victory came with a different consequence. Her reputation. Word spread. Friends who had trusted her financial advice stopped asking for it. Neighbors who once admired her judgment became distant. The hardest sentence she ever heard wasn't spoken by a judge. Came from her own daughter. According to Sophie, one evening Emily looked at her mother and said, "You didn't protect me. You taught me to betray the person who trusted me most." After that conversation, they saw each other far less often. The relationship never fully recovered. For years, Margaret believed controlling everything would keep her family safe. In the end, it left her sitting alone. About a year after the trial, Thomas invited me to lunch. "I have something for you." He handed me a thin folder. "What's this?" "A copy of the final order." "I already have one." "I know." He smiled. "But read the last page." I flipped to the back. Attached was the judge's closing note to counsel. It wasn't legally necessary, just a personal observation included in the record. It read, "This case serves as a reminder that transparency within a marriage is not merely a moral expectation. It is essential when legal rights and shared property are involved. The court hopes all parties leave with a greater respect for honesty than they entered with." I closed the folder. Thomas looked at me. "You know." "What?" "In 35 years, I've handled hundreds of property disputes." He paused. "Very few were actually about property." I smiled. "I figured that out." Not long after that, I planted another oak tree in the backyard. The first one my father and I had planted was beginning to show its age. I wanted something that would outlive me. As I covered the roots with fresh soil, I remembered something my father used to say: "The strongest trees aren't the ones that never face storms. They're the ones that keep growing after them." For the first time, I truly understood what he meant. People sometimes ask whether I would ever get married again. I honestly don't know. Maybe, maybe not. What I do know is this: if I ever share my life with someone again, we'll share more than a home. We'll share every decision, every signature, every account. Not because suspicion is healthy, because honesty is. Trust should never require blindness. When I look back now, I don't remember the court filings first, or the forged deed, or the money. I remember the little moments, the ones that warned me something was wrong. The envelope she grabbed before I could read it, the late-night shredding, the unexplained whispers, the missing statements, the questions I stopped asking because I didn't want to seem distrustful. If this story has one lesson, it's this: love should make you feel secure. It should never require you to stop paying attention. Trust the people you love, but never surrender your voice, your understanding, or your place in decisions that affect your future. That's not distrust. That's partnership. I still live in the same house. The roses along the fence bloom every spring. The porch swing creaks in the evening breeze. And every once in a while, I sit there with a cup of coffee, listening to the neighborhood wake up. For a long time, I thought that house represented the biggest betrayal of my life. Now I see something different. It represents the day I stopped confusing silence with peace and started building a life on truth instead. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Share it in the comments. You never know who might find comfort in knowing they're not alone. If this story kept you with me until the end, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more original karma and betrayal stories. Until next time, take care of your heart, but don't forget to protect your future. The end.